Yet when we suggest that the two ideas are in fact in opposition, it might give us a chance to make the case that the dream is based on domination, and therefore a violation of that core principle. We can ask people how they might reconcile a commitment to an ethic of reciprocity while endorsing a vision of society that leads to unjust and unsustainable world. How can the least among us today, and our descendants tomorrow, knowing that we turned away from the moral commitments we claim to be most dear to us, ever forgive us? I think a critique of the American dream can open up that conversation. Now, let's go back to this notion of the American dream as an epic or a tragedy. The American dream, of course, typically is illustrated with stories of the heroes who lived the dream. But the larger story of the American dream, I think, casts the United States itself as the hero on a global stage. The question we might ask, somewhat uncomfortably, is the United States an epic hero or a tragic one? Literature scholars argue over definitions of terms like epic and tragedy, but I think in common usage, an epic celebrates the deeds of a hero who is favored by, and perhaps even descended from, the gods. These heroes overcome adversity to do great things in the service of great causes. Whatever else happens, epic heroes win. A tragic hero loses, but typically not because of an external force. The essence of tragedy is what Aristotle called hamartia, which is an error in judgment made because of some character flaw, such as hubris. That excessive pride of the protagonist becomes his downfall. Although some traditions talk about the sin of pride, most of us would agree probably that taking some pride in ourselves is psychologically healthy. The problem is excessive pride, when we elevate ourselves and lose a sense of the equal value of others. I think this distinction between pride and excessive pride is crucial in dealing with the American dream, which people often understand in the context of their own hard work and sacrifice. People justifiably take pride, for example, in having worked to start a small business, perhaps, making it possible for their children to get a college education. That's one very common articulation of the American dream. I can tell you stories about my grandfather who came here from Denmark and worked hard his whole life as a blacksmith and a metal worker. I can tell you a story about my parents who came from very modest circumstances and worked hard their whole lives. I can tell you a story about my own hard work. Now that story is true. Excuse me. But also true is the story of domination that created the landscape on which my grandfather, my parents, and I have worked. Pride in our work turns to hubris when we believe that we are special for having worked, as if our work is somehow more ennobling than that of others, as if we have worked on a level playing field. Now, when we fall into this kind of hubris individually, the consequences can be disastrous for us and maybe for those around us. When we fall into this kind of hubris as a nation, when we ignore the domination on which our dreams are based, the consequences are more dramatic. And when that nation is the wealthiest and most powerful in the world, at a time in history when the high-energy, high-technology society is unraveling the fabric of the living world, the consequences are, in fact, life-threatening on a global scale. Now, when I say things like this, people often say, oh, don't worry, empires have come and gone, hell, other species have come and gone, nothing to worry about. The world carries on. Well, that's all true, but it's a disturbingly flippant response that glosses over two important considerations. Yes, it's true empires come and go, but let us not forget that empires cause immense suffering as they are built and immense suffering as they decline. And second, the level of human intervention into the larger world has never been on this scale in terms of any other species. So the collapse of an empire in this context poses, I think, very new risks. And to toss off these questions is, I think, to abandon one's humanity. To face all of this honestly, we need to recognize just how inadequate our existing ideas, projects, and institutions really are. Going back to Wes Jackson, the scientist I quoted earlier, he invoked a friend of his, the late geographer Dan Luton, when he said, us, most Europeans, came as a poor people to a seemingly empty land that was rich in resources. We built our institutions with that perception of reality. Our political institutions, our educational institutions, our economic institutions, all built on that perception of reality. Yet in our time we have become rich people in an increasingly poor land that is filling up, and the institutions don't hold. Developing new institutions is never easy, but I think it will be easier if we can abandon our epic dreams and start dealing with the tragic nature of our circumstances. So to begin wrapping up, I want to concentrate a bit more on this notion of the epic. Let's return to these words of the first American dreamer, our friend James Truslow Adams, who in his book, remember, said, "The epic loses all its glory without the dream." Glory is about distinction, about claiming a special place. The American dream asserts such a place in history for the United States. And from that vantage point, U.S. domination seems justified. Yet the future, that is to say, if there is to be a future, depends on us being able to give up the illusion of being special and abandon the epic story of the United States. Now, I must say it's tempting for me to end there with those of us who might critique the domination-subordination dynamic at the heart of the American dream, lecturing those American dreamers about how they must change. But I think we critics have dreams of our own to give up. We have our own epics of resistance, our own heroes who persevere against injustice in our counter-narratives. Our rejection of the idea of the American dream seems to be absorbed into the dream itself, no matter how much we may object. How do we live in America and not dream? In other words, how do we persevere in a nightmare? Can we stay committed to radical politics without much hope for a happy ending? What if we were to succeed in our epic struggle to transcend the American dream, but find that the American dream is just one small part of a larger tragedy of the modern human? What if the task is not simply to give up the dream of the United States as special, but the dream of the human species as special? And what if the global forces set in motion during the high-energy, high-technology era are in fact beyond the point of no return? Now, surrounded by big, majestic buildings and tiny, sophisticated electronic gadgets that were created through human cleverness, it's easy for us to believe we are smart enough to run a complex world. But we should never forget that cleverness is not wisdom, and the ability to create does not guarantee that we can control the destruction we have unleashed. It may be that no matter what the fate of the American dream, there is no way to rewrite this larger epic, that too much of the tragedy has already been played out. But don't worry, there's good news. We'll end with some good news. Here's the good news. While tragic heroes meet an unhappy fate, a community can learn from the protagonist's fall. Even tragic heroes can, at the end, celebrate the dignity of the human spirit in their own failure. That may in fact be the task of Americans, to recognize that we can't reverse course in time to prevent our ultimate failure, but that in that time remaining we can recognize our own hamartia. We can name our own hubris and excessive pride. We can do what we can do to undo the damage. And that may be the one last chance for the United States to be truly heroic, for us to learn to leave the stage gracefully. Thank you. you're pointing out that people within these institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, they're not stupid. They have a whole lot of information at their disposal, and they understand, maybe not presented in the same way I would, but understand much of what we're talking about. So why don't they change? Well, I quoted James Wolfson, former president of the World Bank. But remember I said these were remarks he made as he was leaving. Right? So when folks in those kinds of institutions tell the truth, it is in fact often when they are leaving. And that reminds us that when they are in positions of power, they are serving the institutions. If they don't serve the institutions, they wouldn't be in those positions. And critical comments and deep self-reflection tends to come when their pensions are secure and they are moving on. Right? Which reminds us that it's not the individuals, it's the nature of the system. So what are institutions like the World Bank and the IMF set up to do? Well, they're set up not to engage us in critical self-reflection, they're set up precisely to maintain the system as it exists. Both the system that governs the distribution of wealth within the human family, that is, they're created to keep the first world first, and they're not set up to critique the system of domination of ecosystems through which that wealth is extracted. So it would be kind of unusual if people working in systems set up to perpetuate something would magically turn. It would be, for instance, I work at the University of Texas, it would be as if all of a sudden administrators started caring about education. Why would you expect that? They care about what they care about, which is money. Money and football, exactly. Yeah, sometimes they throw a bone to those of us who teach, but okay, so that's the nature of these institutions. Now, I think maybe deeper in your question is the evidence is starting to pile up, especially about the health of the ecosphere. You don't have to be a climate scientist. You don't have to be an ecologist. You don't even really have to know much beyond the headlines to know that we are facing a really serious set of crises, multiple crises. Well, here I think there's a psychological problem, and it's not just of the leadership, it's of all of us. We're talking about the fact that the entire system in which we live, whether we're rich or poor, the entire system in which we all live is fundamentally unsustainable. How do 7 billion people in the world start living differently? How do you start to imagine that? I don't have a glib answer for that. Right? It's part of what leads me to wake up every morning absolutely terrified, because I can't imagine an answer to it. It's not just that I'm not smart enough to answer it. I'm not smart enough to answer lots of questions. I'm not worried about my own inability. I can't imagine anyone answering that question. And the social dislocation and the calamities that are likely to come between today and whatever new organization of the human species we find are, I think, kind of dwarf our moral imagination. And part of the reason we don't engage it is because our moral imaginations don't know how to. I think that's a great way of, again, connecting the question of social justice with sustainability. So everyone knows that if you took the level at which ordinary Americans live, the material consumption of, I'm not talking about the Donald Trumps, I'm just talking about us, the people in the room. If you took the level at which we live and extrapolated it to the rest of the world, all 7 billion people in the world would be over tomorrow. The world would literally grind to a halt. I saw a study once of the effects of if the private car ownership rates in the West, in Europe and the United States, were magically present in China. There is not enough metal in the ground to make that work. So we all know, living here, that this can't be extrapolated to the rest of the world, which means it's fundamentally unjust by the ethic of reciprocity. Right? We also know that it's not terribly effective to go to India, China, and other developing societies and say, now you all, we got the goodies, and that's not going to change because we're too used to having them, but you don't get them, because if you get them, then it's game over. That is not an effective pitch. Right? So it does feel like we're kind of trapped. Right? And we also know that we're not talking about individual decisions to reduce our own consumption and be more efficient recyclers.